The UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, where the UCLA campus lies today. We also recognize that the UCLA Lake Arrowhead Conference Center sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, the Uhaviatam people. We would like to thank the sponsors of the 2020 UCLA Arrowhead Symposium online series. Their support enables us to bring you today's program. We thank our partner center, the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, for their support in making today's session possible. This is an interactive session. To participate in this session, use Zoom's built-in chat, Q&A, and raise hand features.
Thank you for joining us in this Zoom side chat titled Outreach to Co-Powerment, Achieving Transportation Justice Through Reparative Planning and Engagement. My name is Dr. Destiny Thomas, and I'm the founder and CEO of the Thrivance Group, a for-profit planning firm working in the interest of racialized people. I'm joined by two colleagues that are very special people in my own personal journey and who are also table shakers and change makers in their own right. Rio Ojas is the co-founder of Raw Oak, and they're a beloved educator focused on collective compassionate understanding. Naomi Dorner is the principal and director of equity, diversity, and inclusion at Nelson Nygaard, and she carries the powerful legacy of being the co-founder and national co-organizer of the Untokening and the first ever transportation equity manager in the United States. This discussion will be formatted to give panelists an opportunity to self-determine their narratives and perspectives in real time. We will discuss themes like collective visioning and having a critical power analysis. We'll also leverage the power of storytelling and multimedia to convey our points in the spirit of those who've come before us in our struggles for liberation, racial justice, and environmental healing. We'll also hold space for panel dialogue and participant questions. Last year, we convened, we wrote, we experimented about the possibility of taking up equity in the urban planning sector. This field danced around the idea of welcoming racialized people into industry spaces and made an ornamental mockery of what could have actually been a timely season of preparation for the horror and traumas our communities are faced with today. As we move through today's session, it's important that you hold the ideas we share in your consciousness, not merely as suggestions for how to modify the status quo, but as calls to actions, demands even, that clarify the extent to which this field must begin to yield to accountability, lean into atonement, and look to those whose labor and likeness have been exploited, punished, and misappropriated in the name of comforting the pit of culpability that sits in the throats of silent so-called allies and obtrusive power-struck practitioners alike. As we partake in this dance, this temporal exercise about what we could and should do, know that there are people in the streets in this very moment doing the work we are only courageous enough to opine about. This field's days of negotiating hows and whens of basic dignity and justice are numbered. I dedicate this session to every racialized practitioner that had to leave this work because the field wasn't ready for them, to the ancestors whose creativity and ingenuity continues to keep us, to the stewards of all land, past and present, and to those whose righteous rage keep the complacent among us tossing and turning at night. And with that, I'd like to get us started with some collective context setting. Each of us will introduce ourselves and our individual framing through the incorporation of multimedia. I'd like to invite Rio to go first.
trigger happy. They don't care what color you are. They shoot and ask questions later.
I wanted to take a moment to share the video from the Move 9, which was a story that my mother gave me when I was in high school. I often tell the story about how I've never been in love with the academy. And my mother worked very hard to give me alternative histories or our own histories as a way to keep me engaged and inspired to do not just activist work, but critical thinking, critical race theory. And the Move 9 story, as well as the story about Mumia Abu Jamal, really sat on me as a young person and has resonated with me, and really is one of the moments or one of the stories in my life that has transformed how I do work. At the Thrivance Group, I always say we do work in the interest of racialized people. And so I wanted to share a clip that illustrated for you all that, you know, this country's legacy of othering people in the built environment continues to lead to the mass-based death, both spiritually and literally, in Black communities, in Brown communities, and of course in our Indigenous communities. And so the aspects of the discussion that I would like to hold today in this collective learning space is really about how we define and identify who's worthy of place, who gets the right to name home, and who has the freedom of moving through space without threat of harm or criminalization. Forgive me, pardon me if I sound winded. I'm struggling with COVID-19. So it takes me a while to get through my statements and collect my thoughts, but I'm here and I'm present and honored to share this venue with my colleagues. So now I would like to invite Rio to share their clip and to talk about their origin story.
We're burning to restore the land, restore the resources, restore water. Today we're burning the redbud and sourberry, which is a three-leaf sumac. Both of them are dying and they need new growth, and in order to get that, we burn it.
Cultural burning is a traditional land stewardship tool employed by Indigenous people all over the world, and it has a very strong history and contemporary practice in California. For the students to not only observe him as a land steward and to listen to his knowledge and the way he approached the work, but also to then be involved alongside him and to be guided by him in those methods, really went even beyond what I had planned for the class.
Bringing you folks in, class from UC Davis, gives us an opportunity to share with you our traditional ecological knowledge and practice, and see it firsthand. I keep telling everybody that for centuries, when the Indians burned all the time, then they could come through and do a broadcast burn underneath, burn all these sourberries without burning these trees.
There's no doubt that fire suppression is one of the leading causes for the fires that we're seeing today in California that are so damaging to communities. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that starting in the mid-19th century, but really in the early 1900s, Native people were prevented from burning across their traditional homelands. And now we're just seeing the result of that policy.
We started this morning with a blessing. We started this morning by asking all our relatives out here permission to come out here. I'm not out here to destroy them. I'm out here to restore and make new life.
The thing is that fires are going to burn whether we want them to or not. What we learn from cultural burning practices is that Native American communities have learned to use fire to their advantage. We need to also learn how to use fire to benefit society.
I see a lot of hope in collaborative partnerships where we find state and private funding in which people can work together to prepare the land for a burn. So do that thinning, take out the overgrowth and the underbrush, do that raking and piling and burning before you can implement a burn. I think that's key. I think people need to be educated about what the land looked like for many years.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Destiny Thomas, for the introduction. And I am also really grateful to be alongside both you and Naomi on this panel. And good morning to everybody who's tuning in. I want to give thanks and acknowledgement first to the Tonga people. I'm in Pasadena right now. And I also want to give gratitude and thanks to Ron Good. In fact, actually, this deer right here is a deer that I got from a deer antler that I got from him when I got to visit him. And I just learned about him recently, and I realized how powerful of work he's doing in our community and the ways that it actually is related to urban planning, how we design streets, how we design our communities. One of the things that really struck me about this video is that to me, it seems like a metaphor for how we could start approaching our communities, our planning of our neighborhoods. He said that the first thing he did before he touches the land is he does a blessing and a permission ask. What would it look like if all of us, anytime we decided to pave down streets, build up homes, design our neighborhoods, that we instead stopped and listened and maybe asked for permission from the elders of the land, from the people who've been in relationship for 10, 15 thousands of years, first and foremost, from the people who are currently living their long-term residence, many of them who are facing still displacement, devastation through evictions, right? We're seeing an increase in Los Angeles of houses people like I've never seen before. And these are the things that I thought, wow, that's really deep. And on top of it, this fire is right now the thing that is damaging so many of our lungs. It actually compromises all of us to the Rona. And sending lots of blessings to you, Dr. Destiny, at this time, because that is a scary thing to have. And understanding that what we have created is an environment in which we have sickened the planet. And in sickening the planet, particularly the respiratory system, right? A lot of us talk about transportation and the devastation it does to climate change. We've also compromised our own respiratory system. And in that way, we become really vulnerable to diseases and viruses that we have manufactured with the ways we live in our lives. And so when I thought about this video, I thought, yeah, we have to go back to the knowledge. And I'm not just saying Indigenous people of Turtle Island. I'm saying Indigenous people from around the globe. There has been a relationship of building and stewarding the land. And so the things that I want to bring to light in this conversation is the concept of stewarding our streets. What does it mean that when we approach urban planning, when we approach designing a neighborhood, we think about stewardship first and foremost for the people that are there, but also the plants, the native flora and fauna that are still existent. People forget that deers are still amongst us. The bears are still among us. Hawks are still among us. And I'm talking about this from the perspective of Los Angeles, the Tonga areas, but it's all here. We still have white mountain sage. We still have Chrissy oak bushes. We still have all of this here. And so that's kind of the place I'm going from. And that's where I decided to venture on to what I am calling a family-owned social enterprise. And I say family-owned because my partner and her 2 kids, we have to work together to make this happen. But I started Raok. Raok actually means in Mayan actually to love. So it's an act of love. So when we're thinking about education or design or implementation, we're thinking about what's our act of love, not just the word love, but an act of love. And in that, Raok also means to think about race, ancestors, health, outdoors, and knowledge. And in that combined format, I feel like we can really design streets and neighborhoods that actually cultivate compassion and love. And I dream of neighborhoods where my mom, who's now an elderly woman, a grandma, who could walk within 20 minutes to every single resource she needs. And that especially was made very in your face during the pandemic, where essential needs were nowhere to be found in a lot of the neighborhoods. And so our elders couldn't walk anymore, and they've been missing out on a lot of the amenities and resources. So that's really the place that I want to talk to about today. So thank you, and I'll pass it back to Dr. Destiny.
Thank you, Rio. Now I'd like to introduce Naomi.
Organizing for what we want, building collaborative strategies, and learning better ways of relating to one another and the planet. Adrienne Mary Brown talked about all that and more when I met with her recently in Detroit. She's a social justice facilitator, a pleasure activist, and the author of Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds. She's also the co-editor of Octavia's Brood, Science Fiction from Social Justice Movements. Here's Adrienne Mary Brown.
Emergent strategies are ways of looking at the world, the natural world that we're a part of, and searching for collaborative efforts. Like, where does collaboration happen? Where is right relationship happening between humans and the planet, between different parts of the planet? And what can we as a species learn about how to be in right relationship with each other and with the planet that we're living on? We're filming this in September, and we've just come through a week where there were 3 hurricanes, an earthquake, a potential tsunami. There was flooding, there's droughts, there's a fire raging the entire West Coast. At the same time, all the news that's coming out of the White House is devastating for our folks. We have people who are like, DACA is the thing that has kept my family together, the thing that has allowed me to be in the place that I'm from. Everything feels like it's so heavy and so intense. And how do we survive this moment? It doesn't feel like we can. And Emergent Strategy posits actually all of these changes, these are something that we need to figure out how we embrace and how we also shape them. So Emergent Strategy is really life moves towards life, longing moves towards longing. And if we're not also organized towards what we really want and what we long for, we will always settle into just reacting and trying to stop something bad from happening. The trick of this book is that everything you need to know is on pages 41 and 42 and on page 50. If you just read those 2 pages, or you can look at page 15. Page 15 also basically has the entire thesis, everything about the book is right there. So this Octavia Butler quote, "All successful life is adaptable, opportunistic, tenacious, interconnected, and fecund. Understand this, use it, shape God." So from that, I would say Emergent Strategy is learning how to be fractal. Small scale reflects the large scale. How to be adaptive in right relationship to change, but also with intention. Because if you just change all the time, you're just changing all the time, you're just a mess, you're just a leaf blown in the wind. But changing with an idea of like, oh, I'm a bird, I'm trying to get to Mexico for my migration, a storm came, how do I still get myself to Mexico? Then nonlinear and iterative, resilient, being in a practice of transformative justice, which I think we are just beginning to understand what transformative justice is or could be for us as a species. And then interdependent and decentralized, and always creating more possibilities. One of my favorite examples right now from the sort of the world of nature has been in this flooding that's been happening with the hurricanes, watching how ants have come together to survive. And they basically create a foundation of their own bodies, like a bottom layer of their own bodies, that then other ants climb on top of until they create this floating mound that then is able to make sure that the majority of them survive until they come across something that is a higher ground. Right now, we are drowning in the overwhelm of this political moment and the overwhelm of hard decisions. How do we reach out and hold on to each other, knowing that holding on to each other makes us a more stable body that can actually float and not pushing each other down, not pushing each other under. One of my favorite examples in the human world is actually the work of Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives, and feeling like this was emergent. It's not like someone sat down at a table and was like, I've got it all figured out. I know how we're going to catalyze Black people into their liberation fight and taking direct action right now. That's not what happened. There was just a heartbreak it really, to me, it grows out of a heartbreak. Like if you look at the original post that Alicia put, it was like, my heart is broken and our lives matter. And that heartbreak was so catalyzed. And other people were like, yeah, how do we organize ourselves around what we long for and we believe in this moment when everything is telling us we don't matter, but we know we do. How do we move that? And that so many people answered that call, and that they have really tried to hold like, oh, what does decentralization look like? How do we keep adapting to changing conditions? Things that organically emerge from a real desire and a real longing, those are the ones that catalyze the most other people. They're super compelling. Like when you see someone feeling a real emotion, that's what you want to move towards and be like, I want to be a part of this. It's not just getting me to sign my name on a petition. It's not just getting me to be a number in the street. You actually want me to care about my own life and my children's life. Yeah, I'm down for that. One thing I say in here several times is what you pay attention to grows. So this administration wants us to put all of our attention on them, and I would rather starve them of all of that attention and put all of it on the amazing work that's happening here in Detroit or in Jackson or in the Bay or in all these other places, St. Louis, where people are like, we are figuring it out, we're surviving. And that's what I'm going to keep doing.
Thank you for having us do these intros, Dr. Thomas. It was actually really fun to try to pick one that really resonated with not only this talk, but this moment. And for those of you who don't know, Adrienne Marie Brown, who introduced themselves at the beginning, they're a racial justice activist and organizer out of Detroit, also works in the Bay Area, and is the author of a couple different books, including Emergent Strategy, which has really been pretty, for me, informative in the work I'm doing and the work that I do with others. I think more than anything, what I think we are looking to stress as part of this this panel is just like being in relationship and right relationship with our communities, you know, and the work that we do and the foundation of it. It is coming from a lived experience and a place of love. You know, I think Leo said it best when they were talking about their business being, you know, family, because it is, right? Like I do this work because of family. I do this work because of community that I'm from, because of the origin of my story and the origin of their stories. With that, I think the reason I chose Adrienne Marie Brown is, as the intro, was the way in Emergent Strategy, they talk about power and they talk about using, right, like what might seem like chaos. And I think we're in a moment right now in our sector and in our world, right, where things just feel impossible. It feels really difficult to find a way, and yet there are ways, and communities have been finding ways to persevere, to live, and not just survive. I think beyond surviving, right, like to really thrive. And so I think there's so much that we can learn from one another, that we can learn from practices that came before, you know, we began to do the work that we do. And our work is really kind of carrying out a certain kind of legacy in the United States that planning holds. I think we all know that mobility is more than just people, you know, transporting or being transported and goods being transported. It's about migration, right? It's about movement, it's about freedom, it's about liberation. It has always been that. And it has always also been true that a lot of our movement, a lot of our migration has been forced. You know, it has been built upon the backs of others. And it is a legacy that, again, we have to examine and know to undo. And so a lot of the work that I do, I have sort of two hats that I'm constantly wearing, and it's kind of a navigation, but many of us who do this work do. And I think it's really important to recognize. But I am a planner. I have a planning background. And I also see myself as more of a facilitator and organizer, right? And I do this very explicitly in my role as one of the co-founders and one of the co-organizers of a group called the Untokening. The Untokening is a multiracial collective of mobility justice leaders from around the country. I am but one. There are many, many, many of us. And we, in a similar fashion, have come to understand ourselves as somewhat of an emergent group and coming up with emergent strategies as it relates to, talking about and actually taking actions to create just futures. And what do I mean by just? I think that our industry and practice and planning, we're just starting to scratch the surface around equity and what does that mean. But justice to me means something different, right? It's over here, it's really like, we're living in our futures, we're living in our freedom, we're living in the worlds that we're creating, where, people of color, Black and brown folks, specifically Indigenous folks, are liberated and free. And it's a different place. It's a different place to operate from there. So the mobility justice space and movement has really, for me, been liberating in terms of a practice and in terms of space, because it's offered healing. It offers strategy, right? And it offers a place to build power. Power that is often not seen and not granted. I think a lot of folks, when we talk about power and talk about justice, I see justice as being the opposite of racism. Racism is when you have power and privilege, and that is what creates an ecosystem in which racism can thrive and can exist. But justice is a place where power is in the people, right? And it is, it is seated by, right, like the powers that be, and it is held, nurtured and fostered, and so the futures and the actual realities that can be lived in a place where justice exists it's held by the base. And so to me, I think that one of the things in terms of co-powerment, right, and this title, when we were planning this session, we were talking about, like, what does power mean? Who has it? Why is that so? And then what does it look like to us? And I think, for us, power is in the people. Power is in the history of our ancestors. Power is knowing that, these lineages and these lives that we have, right? They are the wildest dreams of our ancestors. And so to me, that's power, and like living in that and building that and bringing that into all of the spaces that I inhabit outside of, right, just the space that I've created with colleagues and friends in the Untokening, and really starting to bring that into some of the spaces where I work, such as a private consulting firm, right, working with other planners, starting to share and
Thank you, Naomi. Thank you, Rio. Thank you to our ASL interpreter, Mara. Amazing. I want to remind folks that we do have time to take question and answer from the attendees and participants here. So please use the Q&A feature if you want to provide feedback or ask questions. I'm going to get us going with a couple of questions that came up for me in our preparation for this panel. I'm going to skip around a bit in the questions that I shared with you in advance. The first question that really is coming up for me is, we've talked about, Naomi did a really good job of grounding us in emergent strategies and the importance of social justice. I spoke about the deadly work of othering that is germane to our field of urban planning. And Rio has given us a beautiful perspective around how we can return to our identities as land stewards, as stewards of the land. In doing so, how do we merge all of this into praxis, right? We're in a day and age where everyone is looking for that checklist, that to-do list, those pillars, those principles to guide their work. And I know I've worked with both of you, so I know that that's not how we prefer to work anyway. But what do we make of the need to create immediate interventions and to really see transformative changes in space and in place? How do we do that in a way that honors the spirit and legacy of land stewardship that our ancestors have given us, while also carrying forward both past and present notions of social justice and racial justice?
Yeah, thank you. That's that very powerful question, and thank you all for your origin stories. Definitely powerful. That I think is the crux of where we need to head to is that specific merging. I think for so long, and really this system we're in teaches us to silo and separate and categorize, right? And in doing so, it creates fractions that are not actually healthy. You know, it creates divisions. And so as I'm thinking about stewarding the land and thinking about racial justice and thinking about what that new growth is, I'm going to quote my elder, Olivia Chumacero, who teaches a philosophy called Everything is Medicine. And she always teaches us that it's about the marriage of ideas. And it's not about we're going back to a certain way. It's actually we're bringing these ideas together, right? And then from there is where we start, emergent, right? To use Adrienne Marie Brown's, who I also follow very much and adore for that work. And so when I'm thinking about this, especially where we're at now, especially what we're experiencing in urban planning, is like, first things first, we have to attend to the folks who are feeling really miserable, who are being traumatized by the system, right? So absolutely, I'm definitely with and stand behind the Black Lives Matter movement and leadership. Like that is the leadership we must follow, right? Which does include defund the police. I'm going to say it very openly. That does include that. And along with all the other measures that a lot of the Black Lives Movement Matter leadership is pushing. I think as an Indigenous person, like I am standing in solidarity with that. And that's the second breach, right? That's the second thing we're going to have to break apart, is this idea that we've been divided as like Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color, white folks, etc. Again, to quote one of my teachers, and I am bringing my teachers into it because a lot of what I speak is from my teachers and my elders, right? So I want to acknowledge them. But yeah, a lot of what they're teaching me is remembering to become human beings again. What does it mean to be human beings? And actually, honestly, as I was listening to all of us speak, I was like, yeah, actually, if we're collectively working to take care of the land, by default, we just take care of ourselves. By default, we take care of the most impoverished person. And I always think about this right now, the way that I'm seeing how things have panned out in this pandemic is that we need to go to the communities that are most traumatized, that are most devastated. And that's where we start. And we don't start doing planning the way we've been doing it at a regional or a county level. No, we plan that neighborhood and we actually collectivize with all the different departments, whether it's the mental health department, the housing authority, the public health department, the city planners. And then we look at that neighborhood who's having high rates of diseases, high rates of infant mortality, high rates of etc. And we work there first and we put in all our resources. And a lot of that requires our own trust that it will work, that doing something different will work.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really add to Rio. I mean, I can't emphasize enough like how the, you know, this like notion of, you know, like in your own family, if you were to think about it in your family, right? If someone were not well, you would focus on taking care of that unwell person. I mean, that's just where your attention would be. And so in our society, right, it's the same. When we see that one of us is not well, it should be our inclination, our natural instinct, right? Because why fight against that natural instinct? That's what we do for our loved ones. But if we are so separated that we cannot, as Rio said, feel like our humanity and our care, right? To care, to stop and say, hey, this community is not well, then we are fighting our own natural human instincts, right? You don't even have to look at the data necessarily to know that. I mean, you should, right? Because that's what we do in our industry, right? If we were to look at our data and we were to actually analyze it, right, the way we do everything else, and we were to say, hey, we see for this data that this community, these groups of people, you know, they are not well. We need to put our resources into ensuring that they are well so that we are all well, right? Then that would be a pretty like good use of our time and resources. But it tends to not be what we do. And it's interesting because we do tend to fight our own natural instincts and even our own practices, right? Our practice in the praxis of planning is to use data often, even though we know that data often lags far behind what's actually happening on the ground. But even if we were to just do that, right, it would still tell us where to start. And so I think, you know, I that's not new. I'm just saying something a slightly different way than what Rio just said. But I think I guess the point is we can't really emphasize that enough. That is how you start. That is the way you start. That is how we start with everything else in our practice. So I don't know why we wouldn't start that way when it comes to actually, you know, assessing the health and the you know, wealth of our communities and wanting to do things differently.
I want to take this question a step further because the video that I shared initially was about the experience that the Move 9 had. And for folks who don't know, please look it up. But it was a community in Philadelphia that really had taken on this identity and sense of self-determination around land stewardship to the extent that they were viewed as a threat by their local government, their neighbors, because this is not how we're socialized to care for ourselves in the communities that we lived in, felt threatened by what they saw. They saw recycling bins everywhere. They saw practices like zero waste practices, which meant there were a lot of storage containers to make sure that everything that the house consumed was fully consumed and consumed in an equitable way. The children were being reared to be liberated thinkers, and they had exercise regimens and would jog as a group around the neighborhood, and they loved their animals and their dogs, and in a short amount of time, because these were their sustainable community practices in an urban neighborhood, they were able to generate enough so-called wealth or resources and tools to create a compound. They essentially owned most of the block that they lived on. Neighbors called and complained. Local police began to surveil them. Everyone was suspicious of what's going on in this house. And to enact I think there was a warrant as well as an eviction notice. The sheriff's department came in with tanks and then bombed the building while mothers and children were in it, right? So in thinking about our desire to see our communities who are suffering more so than others take up these practices of sustainability and land stewardship and civic engagement and self-determination, there's an inherent danger in that. There's something about that that makes us hyper visible in the eyes of vigilantes and those who would seek to have us non-existent. So what do we do for the people who hold the legacy of this trauma in their DNA to the degree that they know to be skeptical about this work, right? How do we reach those who are righteously apathetic or unwilling to engage through processes that are facilitated by us as agents of the municipal agencies that are our clients?
I guess I can kick us off. That's a heavy one. That's really deep. Thank you for asking. Yeah, it's a very provocative and very important question, and when you said that, it made me think of, back in like the 1940s in West Oakland, we had the arts district there too that was like Black and brown folks and also decimated, right? We also had here locally, where I was born and raised in Echo Park, the Chavez Ravine, who was an like self-autonomous, self-determined community who also ended up getting bulldozed, literally, right? And now it's the Dodger Stadium, right? And so, yeah, and so now you live with the trauma of it, right? Because you can see the Dodger Stadium, you see the Dodger stuff everywhere, and you're realizing that this community who was self-autonomous, self-determined, had literally their own schools, their own practices, their own food growing there, right? Their own designs of streets get decimated. So it's absolutely like, yeah, like a big thank you and thanks to all those ancestors, right? From the Move 9 and the Chavez Ravine, who lost their lives in the fight for that liberation of our communities and our land. And the only thing I can think of now is that Ra'ok, actually, let me give a little bit more personal story then. Ra'ok was actually a word I learned when I was with the Mayan community out in Tactic. And they are Mayan Ke'ekchi. And the grandmother refused to talk to me in Spanish because she said, that's the colonizer's language. You're going to have to learn how to talk our language. And I was like, oh, okay. And I was honored to get that permission to talk in that way. But one of the deepest things that impacted me was that they had reoccupied a land up at one of the mountains where they've had for thousands of years. And it was taken over by privatized land, taken over by a German mining company. I'm not sure. And what had happened there and what gave awe to me and that continued, like, we got to keep going, was that the woman that took me up there, she said, you see these houses, the reason why we build them with planks and trash is like, yeah, it's economics, but it's also because we got to get ready to go if they burn our homes. That's really deep. That is so profound that they were like, we got to get ready if they burn our homes, but we have to keep doing it, is what she said. And so we can just pick up our stuff and we're going to keep doing it because we're going to keep living our culture because we care for the land and we care for each other. And that's the only thing that I could come close to understanding, like what to do, given that fear, given that the reality that our ancestors have faced, that onslaught, even when we're doing something really healthy and positive, that doesn't only impact our initial communities, but literally at a global scale, right? Because we know that if we're taking care of our earth and each other, by default, the whole world gets taken care of. I mean, the pandemic is showing that we are way more interconnected than we've ever believed in the past, right? So that I'll leave with that story, and yeah, I mean, rest in peace. But some of the folks there did suffer the consequences, right? But they keep going and they keep it alive. And I think that's part of it. And for those folks who are apathetic and unwilling, that was the second part of your question. that's a really tough one, you know, and all I can do is continue to wish people who are having this sickness, I call it a sickness. Hate is a sickness that is inside of them, that I just wish them like blessings all around to get that sickness out of them. That's sick to be living that way. It's kind of miserable, you know, like to feel hate for others, to feel hate for the earth. It's a miserable way to be. And so I just wish them the self-reflection and the joy that many of our communities have found, even amidst trauma. So many of our communities, I know my mom taught me that, you know, even though she was hecka traumatized, she taught me, continue to have joy. It's our life, you know, so I'll end with that.
Yeah, I think well, one, the perception of like, well, maybe it's not, you know, maybe there is real apathy. Like there may be people who have actual apathy and like, I don't really want to participate in this process. I've seen time and time again throughout the legacy of my family that this just doesn't ever pan out, right? Like that is real. And then there are people who have, like you described, you know, Destiny, like real love and real care for their community. They put that love into their community, right? And it doesn't look the way, right, it should look to the powers that be. It has a different aesthetic, right? It has a different sound. And so it's not understood that there is love and there's participation and there's like anything but apathy, right? For community building and community, how to get folks to participate in a process. I think we have to stop seeing it as a transaction. One, you know, I think that's part of our profession's sort of own undoing, right? We see it as like civic duty and like, why don't people care? And it's that's not what it is. It just looks different. And so I think us thinking that one, community needs to come to us or show up when we show up is like, you know, a false narrative. I also think that there is a, you know, like government should look and be representative of communities, right? And if there is nobody at all from like a community that is part of your staff, that has those connections and is in right relationship, right? I want to go back to something that Adrienne Maree Brown said, was that like, we need to be in right relationship. Well, that means relationship is like relating and being of and from. And so I think, you know, that is another, you know, thing that we need to do to change. And then we also need to know this history. I mean, the point you made was like, a lot of people don't know this history. I still find that a lot of people do not know the history of the places in which they are working. You know, I'm just moved to Oakland. I've been spending this time in COVID learning a lot more about the history of Oakland and learning about the history of like what has happened here and the Black Panthers and like, you know, the autonomous zones and the autonomous communities and society that was created here to build power. So I think that we have to understand our history and come to the table with that understanding. And then to a lot of the work that you do, and I'll let you speak to it since you do it. But I think there's the atonement piece, right? Like you don't just get to show up and say, hey, we're doing this thing, not know the history, not be of the community. And on top of that, not acknowledge, right? Like the harm and the hurt and the legacy that this agency, even you may not be like the person that perpetrated that, you're still part of it. And so I think that these factors combined are what contribute to, right? And so it's on us to change a lot of that for anyone to want to come to a table to discuss these issues.
I want to thank you, Naomi and Rio. I want to take a couple of questions from the Q&A box. So I'll read this question from Chanel Fletcher. We work with a lot of state agencies that are steeped in practices that focus on metrics and technocratic decisions are being made. Yes, The issue of data is important. They're just incredibly challenged when they're facing a room of people. Excuse me. The question's moved up, so I'm reading the wrong line from the wrong question. Let me just get to the question. How do we transparently acknowledge our own culpability in terms of white supremacist culture? And what are recommendations to start to shift these state agencies specifically around justice? The how-tos are hard to answer.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I have my volumes down.
Sure. How do we transparently acknowledge our own culpability in terms of white supremacist culture? And what are recommendations to start to shift these agencies specifically around justice? And I'll say before either of you comment, there's a lot of work happening in the transformative justice movement. And there are several models for how to move as inside-outside strategists, agencies toward atonement. And I often, in our own Dignity Institute at the Thrivance Group, work with that cohort to think about the power and impact of narrative, right? And a lot of times, because some of us come from cultures where struggle is welcome and natural and we enjoy it. So we use struggle language that maybe doesn't fare well in the institutions that we've decided to work in, right? So you either choose to not work there, like I have, or you have to learn to develop a narrative that's just as impactful and toward liberation. But maybe it's different. So maybe it's not showing up to work and saying, here's the transformative justice sequence I think we should do, right? And it's about those values living in you and informing every decision that you make and everything that you do, and being able to speak to those values like the back of your hand as tactics and strategies on a dime, right? So I think I love this idea of taking an incremental approach, and as our operations manager would say, eating the elephant one bite at a time, but little bits of it. And I think that's how we see progress, and I think we're used to it in many of our communities because that's how we've had to internalize the slow crawl toward justice in this country. But I'll let either of you add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think so as it relates to trying to remember I was looking for the question in here, but basically it sounds like the question is, how do you start to move your agencies towards like practices, right, around, is it restorative justice, basically? Is that kind of what we're talking about? I mean, I think that there's frameworks, right? And we can talk about those, and they're helpful. But I think that the first step is really, the inside outside is super helpful, right? Because it's like, oftentimes things don't happen in government until there's really like a critical moment, right? On the outside. So being in relationship, remember we talked about that, like being in right relationship with community from the inside to help move, right? Because it's always going to just be slow inside of the agencies. But I think that being in right relationship with the communities are really helpful. And then I think that ultimately, like, acknowledgement has to happen at some point, right? Like there has to be an acknowledgement of like where and what like traumas have occurred. And that takes a deep examination, like a deep internal examination. And that is a process. And that does require a good bit of time. Does it have to? Not necessarily, but it often just does, because we're talking about very large bureaucratic, right, agencies, and then politics as well. So, but I do think that there are ways that I have seen, right, like some pretty powerful acknowledgements. I think Portland Bureau of Transportation and the city of Portland has done that, documented it, you know, and it doesn't mean that those traumas don't exist anymore, but it's like, that's a starting point. So that's just like an example.
Yeah, and I can add to that. Yeah, that's really powerful, you know, statement or question to ask. Chanel, thanks for asking that question. And I think it's really important that, yeah, you so boldly name white supremacy, right? I think we skirt around and get scared of saying that. And I think that at this point, we got to be just owning it and saying it and naming it for what it is. You know, unfortunately, all the systems and the way that planning has done, the way that our education is done, the way that even our healthcare providing is done is from a format that's Eurocentric, right? And by default, that means that it becomes dominant, which becomes white supremacist, right? And it's important to say that because we all, it doesn't matter what color you are, everybody can participate in adding to that, right? And deciding, you know what, I'm here, I'm planning at the state level, or I'm planning at the city level, and I want to keep status quo. And even though it seems quote unquote benign to you, it clearly isn't. We clearly are seeing the devastating effects on our communities, on our earth, and on each other, right? The trust and the relationships that are breaking as we move through these kind of processes. So I think for me, actually, I've been, for a long time, I was a full-on just youth educator, full-on like co-organizer with youth, and only till recently. And I'm gonna do a shout out to people from Mobility Justice who really pushed me to start working with city officials and city planners and at that state level, where I really, like you said, like, oh, I didn't want to, because I didn't want to go in there and you know, feel like I had to code switch essentially, you know, to adapt to some of that. However, in doing it, I've also just come in there and started to, for me at least in the work, when I start engaging with folks across the cities at DOTs and metro agencies, is I really hope that I can uplift their humanity so they can remember themselves, so they can remember, so we can all remember that we all come from Indigenous peoples, right? And that's really important, because I kept thinking, well, what does Indigenous mean? And there's a million definitions. But to me, one of the biggest things that makes Indigenous people is literally the care you have for the land and that relationship you build with the land and each other, right? And if we can remind people that everybody has that in their lineage and they can just remember that, then we're all going to be on the same page. So that's kind of a lot of the work I've been pushing towards. And yeah, another name for it is restorative justice, transformative justice, etc. But ultimately for me, it's like, can you remember your humanity, even as a city planner, even as an engineer? You know, that to me is really important.
Thank you both. I think we have time for maybe one more question. So I'm gonna boil this one down from Jody. What are strategies we can employ so those decision makers can hear, see, and most importantly value the voices of those who aren't in the room for whatever reason? What are some strategies we can employ to get decision makers to hear, see, and value the voices who aren't in the room?
I think you have to leave the room.
I think you have to fire the decision makers.
Yeah.
Right?
Decision makers, and I think you have to also stop meeting in these rooms. And like, I think
that's not the room.
Mm-hmm.
But can we talk about this idea that I think our field is making the mistake of walking in this direction of trying to transform the hearts and minds of people who have been in decision-making positions for a very long time in this field, so that they can meet this moment, right? And be responsive to demands for racial justice and now health equity given COVID. This idea that you can train someone out of their investment in systemic oppression, what do you make of it?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. You know, I feel like for my work right now is a both, right? I feel like there's sometimes there is people we can catch, and it's usually you're right. I think you're, Dr. Thomas, you're so spot on. I think often the people you can catch is maybe folks who are at the more staff level, right? Who don't have as much power and they're really committed. I think there is, in some instances, we see decision makers who can, but ultimately, I will say it right, quite frankly, is we need to replace people, honestly. And I, you know, and we can't have fear for that. Like, it really irks me that we sometimes uphold people who've been in decision-making power, who have a ton of privilege, who make a ton of money, and that we try to protect their jobs. And then there's other people who are way more relevant or way more expert, maybe without all the accolades, maybe without all the certificates that really belong to be there. That's one angle. The other one is this idea of like, and I think to go back to Adrienne Marie Brown, and I think she said it so powerfully, it's like, how do we also focus on our communities fully and pay attention to what we want to grow, right? And so that's a different talk, because that's another set of work that I think a lot of us are also doing, is really creating those neighborhoods, those communities, without the decision makers at the table, right? Like completely out, because we actually have the power to do so. And so I really want to back up and echo Adrienne Marie Brown's words on that, and really continue to uplift the communities that are already doing so powerfully at this time.
Yeah, I think the reality is that we're not gonna, like, the systems do uphold people in power. And so the reality is that like a lot of folks aren't gonna lose their jobs. So we have to hold that, and we have to also like acknowledge that, yeah, maybe these are not the folks, these are not the ones, right? And so how do you build power? How do you actually resource? How do you grow, right, the knowledge that's already there? And when I was saying like you have to leave the room, I think that decisions being made in any room are going to be exclusive and to the detriment of someone. So I think like whoever you bring into the room, it's still a room. So like, how do you leave that room? How do you get out into the community? How do you actually root decision-making in community? So I think that's really like the paradigm shift that is required to restore power and grow power and bring power to where community is. And I think strategies to do that, I mean, people want strategies all day long, but I really think it's like, you know, putting our resources where, I mean, as Adrienne Marie Brown said, like, you know, pay attention to what you pay attention to grows. And so like, if we're paying attention to like training people, then we're just going to put a lot of money into training maybe the people that like don't inherently have the lived experiences that like are required for this moment, right? To change and to create new strategies, who are going to have different strategies. But if you know, pay attention to and grow, right, power in community, like, and you put resources there, then that's where your strategies will grow, and that's what will ultimately, like, I think, change the paradigm.
Wonderful. So I wanted to give both of you an opportunity to make any closing remarks that you may have before I close out the session.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Thomas, for those powerful questions that just really helped me really be more transparent, right, with where I'm at. So thank you, very powerful. Yeah, as far as my closing thoughts, and I think I saw somebody in the chat said that we are acknowledging past harms, but we're very much also acknowledging harms today, right? And harms that even our future generations will have. And the way that I know a lot of us are navigating this is that we're using the past to inform our present so that we can continue to have that future generations, right? So that we don't leave an earth behind that our great grandchildren will come and have to deal with cleaning up our mess, right? Our children, our millennials now, quote unquote, are already dealing with that trauma that we've caused, right, ourselves. And so again, for me, I want to urge everybody for us to start thinking holistically about neighborhoods. So we're not just thinking about like, oh, nice flowing streets with traffic flowing. Like, no, we're thinking about like our most vulnerable person that is able to walk down freely without being harassed by state or harassed by community members or harassed by cars, right? We're creating communities that have all the health resources, the education, the green space, the recreation area, the cultural aspects that one individual will need to feel like full, complete, joyful, and love, so that we're creating neighborhoods that actually love and give a full wraparound to each person. So that's kind of what I want to close off with. And that really requires, yeah, as to your point, really requires people stepping out of the way and creating completely new systems. And we have to have no fear about it. That oh no, if we abolish this system, we won't know what to do. We're humans and we're actually amazingly creative and innovative. And I definitely believe that once that remove, kind of like going back to wrong good, you burn something to make it new and fresh again. It's not for negativity, it's to re-enliven that space.
Yeah, my, I guess, closing thought or closing words are, I think systems, they're designed to do what they do. And they work precisely the way they were designed, and they were designed by people, they were designed by us. And we have the ability to change them. So if we don't like what's being produced, right? If we see that it's creating harm, if we see people are sick, right? As we are seeing today, not just in the past, right? Like people are sick today. That is by design. And we are all part of the system. We are all designers in the system. So we can and do have like the ability to change that. And collectively, right, this power, this mission collective, like collectively, if we all say, this isn't the way we want things to be, they don't have to be this way anymore, right? So to Destiny's point, like, we think decision makers aren't making right decisions. They don't have to be our decision makers anymore, right? If we think, I mean, the point is, if we want change, we have such exquisite power together to make that change. And so I just, for all of you who feel like, who are asking these questions in the chat, like, what are the strategies? How do we are the strategy. It is us. And it is by banding together and by no longer accepting the status quo, no longer allowing our histories, right, to determine what the outcome will be, and to change that narrative and to step into and live into a new future. Like, that is all within our power. That's not like science fiction, that's real. So I just encourage you all to step into that power. For you asking questions, everyone who's asking questions, like, these are the right questions, and this is how you step into power, really. So that's it. That's all I have to say. But it's been a really great conversation. I hope you feel better, Dr. Thomas.
Thank you.
Good seeing you, Vio.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to both of our panels, Naomi and Rio. As I mentioned before, it's an absolute honor to know you and to have worked alongside you. Also, as I mentioned before, when I was winded trying to read the intro, I hope that everyone listening knows that this isn't just us sharing our ideas. It's letting you know that this is the way the work will be done. We're out of opportunities to negotiate and choose whether or not we want equity in our field. So I want to thank you, thank the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies for sponsoring this session. Our next session is this afternoon, Wednesday, October 28th at 1:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and features a discussion on advancing equity through agency actions. But first, we'll be going into a breakout sponsored by the Southern California Association of Governments. Check the chat for the breakout room link. Once you join the Zoom main meeting room, you'll be able to self-select into a room. You may need to close the webinar window in order to participate in the breakout. Please be well and continue your fight for social justice. I'll see you all in the streets.